At 68, I had grown accustomed to slipping through the world with the quietness of someone long overlooked. My name is Lucas Flores, and I live by myself in a small house outside Fort Collins, Colorado. People like to say the area was peaceful, but peace feels different when you are the only one listening to it. My wife had passed 5 years earlier, and in the years since, the only thing that kept her near was the act of cooking. Whenever I chopped vegetables or simmered broth, I could almost hear her humming in the background or picture her leaning against the counter with that patient smile. That morning, I awoke before the sun, closer to 3 than 4. The house was still cold, the kind of cold that crept into your knuckles before you were fully awake. I switched on the lone bulb above the sink and began moving slowly through the familiar rhythm of chopping onions, trimming short ribs, and warming my stiff joints. I had spent more money than I should have on what I planned to prepare for Colin and Julia's celebration. It was a strange hybrid of birthday, anniversary, and what Julia called a social boost, something she could post for her friends. I told myself it didn't matter and that the food would make the night meaningful, even if my bank account looked thinner than frost on the porch. Still, I seasoned the meat with the same gentle care my wife used to, letting the scent of garlic, cumin, and pepper settle into the air. As the pot began to simmer, I moved on to boiling potatoes, roasting vegetables, and whisking batter for a tres leches cake that Colin used to adore as a child, back when he would swing his legs from the kitchen stool, waiting impatiently for the first bite. Now he called only when it was convenient. I pretended the distance between us didn't sting the way it did. By the time dawn softened the sky, the kitchen glowed with warmth. For a brief moment, I imagined my wife sitting at the table like she used to, her presence making the room feel complete. The thought was enough to keep me working. Hours later, with the dishes packed neatly into my old truck, I drove toward Denver. When I arrived at Colin and Julia's immaculate suburban home, Julia greeted me with a photo-ready smile that never reached her eyes. She gestured me toward the kitchen as though I were a hired hand. Throughout the evening, guests admired the meal without once asking who prepared it. And then came Colin's careless joke, the one about feeding it all to the dogs, a sentence that shifted the axis of everything I believed I still meant to him. But I didn't yet know that the moment I walked out of that house was the moment my entire life would begin to turn. The Colorado night was sharp enough to sting as I drove away with the untouched food stacked behind me. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I could hear the containers shifting softly with each bend in the road, almost like they were whispering reminders of the day's effort. My phone lit up again and again, first Colin, then Julia. Each call went unanswered. I couldn't bring myself to look at the messages. Not yet. What I felt wasn't anger. It was deeper, quieter, something like a hollow settling inside my ribs. The highway unspooled ahead of me in long, dark stretches. I didn't know where I was headed, only that home wasn't where I needed to be. The silence in the truck felt too tight, too full of unspoken things. Then the phone rang again, and instinct made me check the screen. This time the name was Luis, my nephew. His voice cracked the moment I answered. He told me his head chef had collapsed from a sudden fever less than an hour earlier. Their restaurant, Ridgefire Kitchen in Boulder, was supposed to cater a major wedding that night for the Markham Pierce family. Everything was falling apart. Behind him I heard voices, clattering pans, the frantic rhythm of a kitchen slipping into chaos. He said canceling the event might bankrupt the place. He didn't ask me directly for help. He simply sounded like a man drowning who didn't know where to reach. I looked into the rearview mirror at the containers stacked neatly in my truck bed. All that food, the careful preparation, the pride I had tried to carry. Maybe it wasn't meant to be thrown aside. Maybe it wasn't meant for people who couldn't taste the heart in it. Without thinking, I told Luis I was on my way. The drive into Boulder felt different, purposeful, almost grounding. When I reached the restaurant, Luis met me at the door with panic etched into his expression. Inside, the kitchen was a whirlwind, steam rising, staff shouting instructions over each other, vegetables half-prepped, pans burning too hot. I set the containers down, opened them one by one, and saw what I had created that morning with grief tugging quietly at my sleeves. The ribs glistened, the vegetables held their color, even the cake looked untouched by the long drive. And suddenly, everything inside me clicked into place. I told Luis we could salvage the event if we moved fast. He stared at me like he wasn't sure whether to hope yet. He didn't know that the next few hours would change far more than his restaurant's fate. They would change mine. Once my sleeves were rolled past my elbows, a steadiness settled into my bones, the same steadiness I hadn't felt since cooking with my wife for community events decades ago. The young line cooks watched as I spread the dishes out across the stainless steel counter. I spoke calmly but quickly, assigning tasks like I'd been leading kitchens my entire life. Heat a pan, I told one. We'll build a reduction sauce using the rib drippings and red wine. To the other, cut the vegetables into clean, even slices. Presentation matters tonight. Something changed in the room. The panic thinned. The clattering grew purposeful. Soon the kitchen found its rhythm, a rhythm I recognized, one built on trust, timing, and the quiet certainty that good food could still save the night. We seared the ribs again to deepen the color, arranged the vegetables elegantly, and plated each dish as if we had planned it all along. The smell of herbs, caramelized onions, and warm spices filled the air. My hands moved without hesitation, as though decades of practice had been waiting for a moment like this. By the time the first plates went out, the chaos had transformed into a hum of focused motion. Through the service window, I could hear murmurs of approval. A guest laughed softly, the sound filled with delight. When dessert went out, slices of the tres leches cake drizzled with the light fruit syrup the staff whipped together. I saw clean plates returning almost immediately. When the last dish left the kitchen, the staff exhaled as one. I stepped into the hallway to breathe, wiping sweat from my forehead. That was when an elegant older woman approached me. Her hair was silver, swept neatly back, and she wore an expression that blended gratitude with curiosity. She introduced herself as Juliet Markham, mother of the bride, and, as she mentioned casually, head of a well-known philanthropic foundation. She said she had insisted on meeting the person responsible for saving the wedding dinner. Her eyes lingered on me, not in judgment but in recognition. She asked where I had trained. I told her the truth. I hadn't trained professionally at all. I had learned in my own kitchen, next to a wife who believed in small details and quiet excellence. Juliet smiled, not the polite kind people wear for pictures, but one that suggested she saw something useful, maybe even extraordinary, in a man most people mistook for invisible. She leaned closer and said, "A man with your talent shouldn't be hiding in the background of anyone's life." The word struck deeper than she could have known. I didn't realize then that Juliet Markham would become the doorway to a life I thought I was too old to claim. 2 days after the wedding, Juliet invited me to meet her at a quiet cafe in Boulder. The air smelled of roasted beans and warm pastries, and sunlight spilled across the table between us. She spoke with a confidence softened by genuine kindness, a combination that made it easy to listen. Without ceremony, she slid a check across the table. A retainer. She said she wanted me to cook for her foundation's events, to bring the kind of heart-driven meals she believed people rarely encountered anymore. The number written on it startled me. For a moment I wondered if she had mistaken me for a professional chef with credentials I didn't have. But her expression made it clear. She knew exactly who I was and what I could do. So I began spending my days working in a small corner of the Ridgefire kitchen while Luis and his staff handled their evening service. I tested sauces, adjusted plating styles, and scribbled ideas into my recipe notebook. The young cooks drifted over during breaks, curious. They watched me reduce broths, shape vegetables, coax flavors forward gently instead of overpowering them. When they called me Chef Lucas, the word sat strangely in my ears, but pleasantly so, like a shirt that finally fit after years of wearing hand-me-downs. Our test dinner arrived on a Friday night. 40 donors sat beneath warm, flattering lighting while servers carried the plates I had crafted. I watched from the doorway, listening for reactions, and they came. Soft praise, satisfied murmurs, forks scraping plates until nothing was left. When Juliet introduced me afterward, the applause wrapped around me like a blanket I hadn't realized I'd been cold without. The next morning, I found Colin and Julia sitting stiffly in my living room. Julia announced her pregnancy with a hopeful smile, but underneath it was the familiar expectation, the assumption that I would fold back into the role of unpaid help, the backbone of their household, the reliable figure who filled in every gap without complaint. They spoke slowly, circling the point, hinting about childcare, long schedules, and how we'll really need you. Their meaning was clear, but something inside me had shifted. I told them gently that I would be a grandfather, not a replacement parent, not a silent support beam propping up their lives. I said I had real work now, work that respected my time and skill. The room chilled with confusion. Their version of me didn't fit who I had become. What none of us knew then was that choosing myself would open doors I never expected to walk through. I moved into my new apartment in Longmont on a crisp morning when the sky still carried early-day pastels. The building sat near a lake, and from the kitchen window I could see thin ripples of gold on the water where the sun began to stretch across it. The apartment was small but clean, and for the first time in many years, every inch of it belonged solely to me. Not shared memories, not obligations, not unspoken expectations. The kitchen, bright with natural light, felt like a quiet promise. I could chop vegetables by the window and watch geese drift lazily through the reeds. I unpacked slowly, letting the stillness settle around me like a gentle weight. This was a place earned, not given, not provided, not begged for. With Juliet's support, I officially registered my catering venture under the name Florist Table. Seeing the name in print felt unreal. It carried a kind of self-respect I had rarely allowed myself. Luis let me continue prepping in an unused corner of Ridgefire Kitchen, while I searched for a small commercial space of my own. In a matter of weeks, word spread. The donors from Juliet's test dinner reached out with new opportunities. Weddings, corporate gatherings, intimate luncheons. Each time someone requested my name specifically, something inside me glowed like a slow-burning ember. One morning, while stopping for coffee before work, I noticed a stack of community newspapers near the counter. I reached for one absent-mindedly and froze. There, printed on the front of the local features section, was my picture. The headline read, "Florist Table, a late-blooming chef bringing heart back to bolder events." My breath caught a little. The article spoke about starting over later in life, about rediscovering purpose when most people assume their best chapters have already passed. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my coat, unsure whether to laugh or cry. But success didn't erase the past, and Julia proved it when she showed up unannounced at my apartment a week later. When I opened the door, she stood there with a plate of cookies and a subdued expression I had never seen on her before. We sat at the small table by the window, the afternoon sun catching in her hair. She apologized. Not carefully, not strategically, but sincerely. She explained that the phrase, "feed it to the dogs," came from her own painful childhood, words her father used as weapons. Laughing at it had been her only defense. Hearing Colin repeat it that night had stirred something she hadn't processed. For the first time, I saw her not as someone who had wronged me, but as someone carrying her. And yet, this apology was only the beginning, because another conversation was waiting just around the corner. A few days after Julia's visit, Colin arrived at the small commercial kitchen I had just begun moving equipment into. The space still smelled of fresh paint and stainless steel polish. I was directing a team of young cooks through preparations for a luncheon when I noticed him standing quietly in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. When the team paused for a break, he approached. His voice was softer than I expected. "Dad," he said, "I didn't realize how much you were carrying all these years." He looked around the kitchen, the organized stations, the intentional movement of my staff, the respect in the way they listened. I could see something dawning on him, a kind of recognition he should have arrived at years ago, but better late than never. He apologized. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was clumsy, slightly tangled, and spoke of truths he hadn't fully realized until recently. He admitted that he had taken my help for granted, that he had allowed comfort and familiarity to blind him to the sacrifices I made. The apology cost him something, pride, perhaps, or the illusion that he had always been the responsible one, and that honesty made it meaningful. We talked then, not as father and son caught in old habits, but as two adults trying to understand each other again. We discussed the baby, boundaries, and how we could build a healthier relationship, one not dependent on me quietly carrying the weight of his choices. Later that evening, after I returned home and hung my apron on its hook, my phone buzzed with a video call. When I answered, Colin and Julia appeared on the screen, standing in their kitchen. Julia held a wooden spoon covered in sauce, smiling sheepishly. They asked if I would come to dinner, their dinner, with Julia doing the cooking. It was a small gesture, but the meaning behind it reached somewhere deep inside me. They weren't asking for help, or labor, or sacrifice. They were inviting me simply to be part of their home. After the call ended, I stood by the window overlooking the lake. The water was still, fading into the cool blues of evening. The silence inside my apartment felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. The kind of peace that comes from choosing your own life, rather than being pulled by the lives of others. Forgiveness, I realized, didn't require me to return to old patterns. It simply required understanding, for them, and for myself. But even then, standing in that quiet room, I didn't yet grasp how far this new path would take me. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both new and strangely natural. Flora's table grew steadily, each event building on the last. Word of mouth traveled quickly through Boulder's event circles, and soon I found myself with more opportunities than I had imagined possible just months earlier. The young cooks I trained blossomed under clear guidance and a kitchen environment built on respect, not fear. Watching them reminded me how many years I had spent undervaluing my own ability to lead. My relationship with Colin and Julia gradually softened into something healthier. I visited them for dinner, Julia's cooking improving each time, and we spoke openly about the baby on the way. They no longer assumed I would be the first solution to every problem. Instead, they asked, listened, and offered support in return. It felt like stepping into a new chapter of fatherhood, one defined not by sacrifice, but by mutual respect. In quiet moments, I found myself thinking about my wife. I wondered what she would say as she saw me now, standing over a professional stove, guiding young chefs, building something of my own. I imagined her proud smile, the way she used to squeeze my hand when she believed in me more than I believed in myself. In many ways, Flora's table felt like a continuation of the life we built together, carried forward on the memory of her kindness and her love for good food. One evening, Juliet invited me to attend a major foundation gala as a guest rather than a caterer. I wore the one suit I owned and felt slightly out of place among the donors and business leaders, until Juliet introduced me as the man who brought heart back to the table. The applause that followed was gentle but sincere. I realized then that this late-in-life chapter wasn't accidental. It had grown from heartbreak, yes, but also from resilience, generosity, and a willingness to start again. Driving home that night, the roads quiet beneath the white Colorado sky, I felt an unexpected sense of belonging, not to a place or a role or another person's expectations, but to myself, to my own choices, my own worth. Life hadn't given me the ending I thought I would have, but it had offered me something different, a second beginning, shaped not by who needed me, but by who I had finally allowed myself to become. And as I pulled into my driveway, I understood. Sometimes the most extraordinary chapters begin long after we believe the story is already over.